This is the first of two study days for the season of creation. The second one will be on the 2nd of October, the cry of the poor, and we'll look at the encyclical of Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, which came out October last year. But today we're looking at Laudato Si with this presentation, the cry of creation. 50 years ago, and I'm quoting here from Pope Francis, at the beginning of Laudato Si, Pope Paul VI, Saint Paul VI, said, due to an ill-considered exploitation of nature, humanity runs the risk of destroying it and becoming in turn a victim of this degradation. And of course, that situation has only got worse, or seems to have got a lot worse. And if we remember the events of recent times, we know that there is a very serious situation for all countries of the world, and particularly for the poorest. So to present Laudato Si and then Fratelli Tutti, I'm very pleased that Father Dr. Ashley Beck has made himself available for us. Ashley is Associate Professor at St. Mary's, Twickenham, and an expert in Catholic social teaching. So we're delighted, Ashley, that you've not only agreed one talk, but two talks, two separate days. And I'm sure everybody is delighted that you'll be presenting these two very important encyclicals of Pope Francis for us. So without further ado, welcome, Ashley, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Adrian. I hope people can hear me clearly. It's very good to be with you this morning. About 3 years ago, I think I came to Gidea Park to give a talk in live time, so to speak. One of my jobs is that I help to train permanent deacons for most of the dioceses in southern England, including the Diocese of Brentford. And we've had many great students over the years, so it's good to be, so to speak, partly in Gidea Park this morning. Before I start introducing things, I feel I ought to give a barefaced commercial. Adrian kindly mentioned my relationship to Catholic social teaching. At St. Mary's University, one of my big jobs is that I run the only MA degree in Catholic social teaching in Western Europe. And one of the big things we cover are the issues in Laudato Si and indeed now Fratelli Tutti. So if anybody of you feels inspired perhaps to sign up for this degree, we're starting teaching this month, so now is the time to sign up. And if you go on the university website, you can find out more. The context for this talk really and our consideration of the Pope's encyclical is various things happening this year. The forest fires that happened in much of southern Europe in the summer, various other things going on in the planet have concentrated our minds afresh. Similarly, the 6th report of the UN IPCC, which came out earlier in the summer, has indicated that things in relation to our care for the planet, or lack of care for the planet, are even worse than we thought. It's interesting that one of the things Pope Francis was accused of by his critics 6 years ago was being unduly alarmist and gloomy. And I think now we're seeing that things were worse than they appeared to be back in 2015. And of course, we're also in the months leading up to the COP26 summit in Glasgow in early November, which the Holy Father is coming to. So this is a really crucial time to be thinking about this letter. And as Father Adrian said, we're at the beginning of the season of creation, which Pope Francis set up a few years ago. In the immediate aftermath of Laudato Si, he established a day of prayer for the care of creation on the 1st of September each year, which was a straightforward borrowing from the Eastern Orthodox churches, as this had been started for them by Patriarch Bartholomew some years ago. So we really do need to see the issues addressed by the Holy Father in this letter as a theological priority, a priority for the whole church, not just for academics or theologians, but for ordinary parishioners, every member of the faithful, really. We can't overemphasize its importance. At the beginning of each year, the Pope addresses diplomats who are accredited to the Holy See. And this year in February, I think slightly later than usual because of COVID-19, in his address to diplomats in Rome, he said that one of the signs of a world that is sick is what we're doing to the environment, we're doing to creation, alongside many other signs. So it's important, I think, spiritually and liturgically, we often encounter healing ministries, healing miracles of Jesus in his public ministry, at Mass during the week, Mass on Sundays. And I think in a way, those healing miracles point us to a world that is sick and in need of healing. And part of what the Holy Father is trying to do, I think, in this letter and in the follow-up to it, is to help us see how a world can be healed. There's a great deal going on in terms of intellectual debate, theological debate around the issues addressed in Laudato Si. A lot of conferences happening at the moment in the church are devoted to this topic. Last week, there was a big international congress at Osnabrück in Germany of the European Society for Catholic Theology. I was able to join in some of the talks by Zoom, and some theologians from this country were taking part. The Catholic Theological Association in this country is devoting its online conference next week, again to this topic, which are running jointly with the Irish Theological Association, and it would ordinarily have been at Maynooth, but the whole thing is online. There's even now a new study centre named after Laudato Si in Oxford, based at Campion Hall, the Jesuit college. There's a lot going on in the life of the church. Much of it is being led by the Bishop of Salford, Bishop John Arnold, who's issued a statement only today in the run-up to the summit in November. What is particularly useful, I think, is very good material which CAFOD, our aid agency, brought out for use in schools very quickly after the encyclical emerged. So what I would like to stress at the very beginning is that although some of the issues that the Pope looks at seem at times rather technical and perhaps rather forbidding, particularly if we don't, unlike him, have a scientific background, it is possible to make the message accessible to people, and a lot of work has gone into this. Some interesting facts about Laudato Si, which I only discovered on revisiting it in the last few days. It used to be said that the only papal encyclical that had ever been set to music was John the 23rd's Pacem in Terris, or parts of it, by Darius Milhaud. Parts of Laudato Si have now been set to music by a German composer in an oratorio that came out 2 or 3 years ago. But part of why I want to address this topic with you this morning is that there is still a great deal of resistance to understanding its importance within the life of the church. Shortly after it came out, one of my MA students at St. Mary's, who's a deacon in the Southwark Diocese, did as his dissertation the reception of Laudato Si in parishes in his area in southwest London. It's a very good dissertation. He worked on it in the year or so after the encyclical came out, but it's also a very depressing piece of work because he encountered an almost universal lack of interest and lack of knowledge from local clergy in his deanery. There was even a diocesan catechetical centre in the area, and they weren't interested either. They simply referred him to the Diocesan Justice and Peace Office. And as I'll reflect in a minute, there are still big issues, big areas of the church where the whole approach of the Holy Father is challenged. So, by way of introducing the letter as such, I want to start by stressing that it's essential that we see Laudato Si as a work of theology. It's not a religious gloss on environmental politics. In the letter, particularly the introduction, the Holy Father makes it very clear it has a theological remit before anything else. Part of why there was quite a lot of publicity when the encyclical appeared in May 2015 was that it was leaked somehow to the press before it was properly launched. This led to even more publicity surrounding it because there were some, particularly in the United States, who were opposed to the Holy Father's approach. But in the initial sections, the Pope stresses that this document has to be seen as part of the corpus, the body of Catholic social teaching, part of the ordinary magisterium, as we call it. That is the ordinary teaching ministry of the Church in the ministry of the Pope and bishops in communion with him. And this really does need to be stressed, particularly if we try to evaluate critical reactions to it. Some of you will know that in the key document on the Church of the Second Vatican Council, the constitution known as Lumen Gentium, we're reminded that Catholics are expected to, and I quote, adhere with religious assent to the ordinary teaching of the magisterium. Now, we should remind ourselves of this whenever we look at a papal document, papal encyclical, but I think it's particularly important in relation to this letter because people have chosen in many ways not to adhere with religious assent to it at all. It needs to be seen as part of the body of Catholic moral teaching, that part of our moral teaching, which we call Catholic social teaching. So it's in the tradition of Rerum Novarum, Quadragesimo Anno, and so on, and a very, very important contribution to the development of that theological tradition. When the encyclical came out, I was asked by the Catholic Herald to contribute to their blog, so a very short piece in which I summarized the letter and pointed out what I've just said to you. And there was an extraordinary reaction from those who read the Catholic Herald blog, almost all very critical of what I'd written. The only thing that gave me some slight comfort was that they seemed, the sort of people who sent the contributions in, to be much more hostile to Pope Francis than they were to me. So it became a very important and controversial event in the life of the Church. Another interesting point to make at the very beginning is that what's striking about the Holy Father's approach in this letter compared to previous documents, not only from him, but from his predecessors, is the way he uses sources. I was thinking in encyclicals, it's quite interesting looking at the footnotes to see who is being drawn on. Traditionally, popes will draw on the teachings of their predecessors, ecumenical council documents, sacred scripture, theologians, fathers of the church, and so on. But something that's striking in Laudato Si is that in addition to that, and there's a great deal of sourcing of his predecessors, particularly Benedict XVI and St. John Paul II, Francis goes out of his way to draw on documents from bishops' conferences all over the world. It's a fascinating geographical distribution if you look through the footnotes, particularly from countries in the developing world. This is important in itself because at times people have sought to marginalize the teaching ministry of bishops' conferences. It's clear that the Pope is affirming this and sees the bishops as his partners in the exercise he's undertaking. He also quotes Dante, the French philosopher Ricoeur, Romano Guardini, who was an important influence on Pope Francis. He began to do a thesis, a dissertation on him when he was a student. Guardini also, of course, an important influence on Benedict XVI. The 1992 Rio Declaration, the French Jesuit theologian and anthropologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and the 9th century Sufi mystic Ali al-Khawass. So that in itself is striking and it's fascinating. The other thing to remember, and some of you may be familiar with this, is that Francis constantly uses a method often associated with justice and peace work, with other catechetical exercises in the life of the church, the method of see, judge, act. You look at a problem, you make a judgment about it, and then you decide on a course of action. He uses this again and again, but it's particularly important in this letter. The other thing I think you need to bear in mind is that you can't really understand Laudato Si unless you have in your mind some awareness of prophets in the Bible. Now, I hesitate to say anything about sacred scripture in the presence of Father Adrian, who is a renowned biblical scholar and a member of the Pontifical Biblical Commission. But I found in trying to explain Laudato Si to students and parishioners that people have a problem about the Pope's approach. And one of the problems people had when it came out was that they thought it was an excessively gloomy letter. Then just go and read the beginning of the book of Amos. That's a picture on the right, by the way, of Elijah. It's important to remember, and I'm sure Adrian will correct me wrong, that in the Old Testament, the most important thing about prophets is not predicting the future, but proclaiming God's judgment to the community in which they're working, to the rulers and so on. And this is often, particularly in the earliest prophetic material, very harsh and unrelenting. It's not meant to be an easy read. Interestingly, Catholics have been exposed to the prophets much more than they would have been in the past. As you know, it's just over 50 years since the lectionary, which we use at Mass on Sundays and weekdays, was brought out as a result of the reforms ushered in by the Second Vatican Council. Before that, Catholics had hardly ever heard the Old Testament read in church at Mass. And in the selections that we have, both on Sundays and weekdays, we do hear a fair amount from the prophets. So we're more exposed to their insights and to their harsh and unrelenting message than we were in the past. But of course, that also helps us understand that for all that Pope Francis is realistically quite gloomy about how things are, there's also a message of hope. And this is reflected too in the development in the prophetic books in the Old Testament, in the later parts of books and so on. So I'd suggest that in a way, we can see the Old Testament prophets as a tool really to help us understand the Holy Father's approach. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire document section by section. Apart from anything else, it would take too long. And there is really no substitute for reading the thing and reading it again and again, reading it prayerfully, slowly, carefully, perhaps not all at once, but bit by bit. But I think the point of a talk of this kind is to try and pinpoint some things in it and suggest some good starting points. The important thing to be clear about, I think, is that the Pope doesn't mince his words in terms of dire warnings, really, which he puts before us. That is a picture, by the way, of him when he was awarded the Charlemagne Prize, which is a prize connected with the affirmation of European unity given to people who have contributed towards European unity, given by the European Union. He was awarded it a year after Laudato Si, just before the Brexit vote in this country. That's why there's an EU flag in the background. In the early sections of Laudato Si, the Pope lists and describes in considerable detail the extent to which we are damaging the planet through pollution, through our use of water shortages, pollution of water, the damage we're doing to biodiversity across species, the decline in human life that results from all this, leading to a breakdown of society. This is really important. Sometimes environmental concerns about the future of the planet are portrayed as being something simply to do with animals, plants, the seas, and so on. What the Holy Father is constantly concerned to stress is that there's always a link between all this and what we're doing to ourselves. How human beings suffer as a result of what we do to the planet, particularly those who are poorest in the world. So he repeatedly, throughout the document, cites ways in which it is the poorest on Earth who suffer most because of environmental damage. And of course, the problem is that it is often underdeveloped economies which are less able to clean up the ways in which they do things and so on. So it's a real challenge to richer nations in the world to give more support to poorer nations so that they can reduce environmental damage. The second thing which I think is important as part of this, and this is what was attacked by many people, is that the Pope accepts the majority scientific view of the reality of the danger of climate change. And it's interesting, I think, to draw on the fact that the Pope's first degree when he was a student was in physics. He's therefore unusual as a Pope in having a scientific academic background. So he's therefore more confident, I suppose, than many of us would be in assessing evidence and realities. And this confidence, I think, is important. Catholic social teaching isn't simply about the Church coming up with answers to world problems. A lot of it is about a dialogue between the Christian community and people in different areas of study, different areas of life, members of different faiths, religious backgrounds, and so on. So particularly in Catholic social teaching, the Church engages in dialogue with economists, scientists, political philosophers, and so on, as we formulate and develop Catholic teaching. And the way in which Francis listens to the scientific evidence in Laudato Si and brings it into a teaching document is really quite important. But for those, particularly in the United States, who've always felt very threatened about by the majority scientific view, this is a real problem. And such people who were in the Catholic community have a particular problem. For most of the period since the letter emerged in May 2015, the government of the United States was led by administration and the president who is openly skeptical, if not hostile, to the majority scientific view. If you look similarly at the leadership of Brazil and other countries, you can see similar tendencies. Brazil, of course, the center of much of what is important, particularly in the Amazon. And it's important, I think, in other ways too, because the Church is showing respect for people who can be called experts. During the 2016 Brexit campaign, and I spoke a bit about this the last time I was speaking in Gidea Park, the government minister famously said that we had no need of experts. Well, Laudato Si shows, and much of what Pope Francis shows, is that we do have needs of experts. We do need to be in dialogue with experts. And the Church has always taken this seriously. And the Pope isn't saying things that are radically new. In the encyclical, he constantly refers to other church bodies. He's not simply coming up with things that he's saying from his own head. I've mentioned Bishops' Conference documents, and the range with which he looks at these is far greater than in previous letters. Also, the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. He draws a lot on the Compendium of Social Doctrine of the Church, which is a companion volume to the Catechism, which emerged, it came out in 2004. And as with most encyclicals, there's a strong sense of continuity. So he repeatedly quotes, particularly St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI. This is important for all sorts of reasons, because many of those who actively oppose and try to undermine the ministry of Pope Francis claim to be loyal, particularly to Benedict and sometimes to John Paul as well. So he's accused of discontinuity, of rupture with the ministry of his predecessors. This is a very false view. And part of how the Holy Father shows that is precisely through the extent to which he draws on the teachings of his predecessors. In particular, the last encyclical letter of Benedict, Caritas in Veritate, which came out in 2009, which isn't about the environment, it's about mostly the world financial crisis and so on, but it does draw on environmental problems as well. And I'll show you a specific example of how Francis picks up one of Benedict's ideas and reapplies it. So in a way, the most important message to emerge from Laudato Si is that you can't really claim to be a faithful Catholic if you are a climate change denier. And it's as simple as that. And that is why this letter, and indeed the whole ministry of the Holy Father, is a big challenge to some Catholics, particularly in the United States, but plenty of people here as well. But it needs to be stated very clearly. There's no room for ambiguity about this. Just want to give you an example of the strength of his language. This is from section 53 of the first big chapter, What is Happening to Our Common Home. Pope, under the heading Weak Responses, says this: these situations have caused Sister Earth, along with all the abandoned of our world, to cry out, pleading that we take another course. Never have we so hurt and mistreated our common home as we have in the last 200 years. Yet we are called to be instruments of God our Father, so that our planet might be what he desired when he created it, and correspond with his plan for peace, beauty, and fullness. The problem is that we still lack the culture needed to confront this crisis. The passion of the Holy Father's language is something which is important always to keep our eyes on, really. That's why it's a tremendous thing to quote in homilies, in other talks, and so on. Now, what I say to students and parishioners is that for what is quite a forbidding document in some ways, it's useful to think of good ways in. And in a way, what I would suggest, if you haven't read it, is that rather than start at the beginning and read the rather gloomy first chapter, it might be worth starting in chapter 2, because chapter 2 is really an extended scriptural reflection. in which the Holy Father develops a very deep theology of creation, drawing particularly on the scriptures. Now, again, I could quote large chunks of chapter 2, but it's much better, I think, for you to try and read it yourselves, or perhaps in groups if you're with other people. And he does this in order to stress that the responsibility that we have for the planet is something that's sacred. It's given to us by God. He also goes out of his way to demolish the ways in which the idea of dominion given to humanity over creation in the book of Genesis is sometimes seen as justifying our abuse of the planet. He makes it quite clear that for that responsibility to be abused is a misreading of that scriptural passage. But it is quite common, particularly amongst fundamentalist Christians in different places. So the problem is a real one. And I think for some theologians, I think it's been pointed out that perhaps our dullness or our inability to take this problem seriously is because of the residual effect of misinterpreting that passage in Genesis. So it's good that the Pope deals with it, but I think the problem is still there in the way that a lot of Christians think. He also enlarges in chapter 2 the dangers of over-reliance on technology and the danger of seeing humanity or man as being at the center of the universe. And this is quite important in terms of the theological approach of the letter. Further on in the letter, he develops the idea of an integral ecology. And this is important too. There's a whole chapter headed in that way. What we say about care for the environment, for creation, has to be seen alongside other concerns and priorities of Catholic social teaching. There was a cardinal in Chicago a few years ago, Bernardin, who always reminded people that Catholic social teaching is a seamless robe. All the issues that we address are connected. And this is particularly important, I think, in relation to care for creation. We can't take the problem seriously if it's divorced from what we say about justice for the poor, about the right way to run an economy, and so on. And it's essential, therefore, to see the approach of Laudato Si in the context of Catholic social teaching overall. So it's important that he draws on, for example, Benedict XVI's Caritas in Veritate, which is about the economic and financial affairs in the world. And we come back repeatedly to the message that it is the poor who suffer most in the world because of the cry of the earth, the damage we're doing to the planet. John Paul II and Benedict XVI made the liberation theology concept of the preferential option for the poor a mainstream part of Catholic teaching as far back as the 1980s. But Francis has underlined this again and again, because he's from Argentina, from Latin America, where this tradition was first developed. The idea of the preferential option for the poor has to be central to how we implement changes in the ways in which we relate to the planet. By the way, the picture on the right is a statue of St. Francis. One of the things that people criticized when the letter emerged were some specific courses of action which the Pope called for at the end, towards the end of the letter. He does make it clear, and this is important, that the Church doesn't claim to have all the answers. It is in dialogue. We, in a sense, are admitting that we need to learn from others, both different disciplines academically, other faiths, denominations, and so on. But he does make some specific recommendations. This is important methodologically as well. It's sometimes claimed that Catholic social teaching isn't about specific policies, but simply about general principles. That we talk about solidarity, the common good, subsidiarity, and so on, and then we just let people make up their own minds about how they apply these things. That's a very false view. The Church has always recommended specific courses of action ever since we started reflecting on the concerns addressed by social teaching from the 1890s. So the Holy Father makes some very specific calls that international agreements about the environment, about issues like pollution, need to be properly enforceable. This, of course, was something challenged a great deal by the last US government, challenged too by the current leadership in Brazil. So the idea that international agreements should have authority to enforce courses of action is challenged by many people on the grounds of what they believe about national sovereignty. He also called for businesses to be made to carry out environmental impact assessments for their propositions. So you shouldn't be allowed to do something anywhere without the impact of what you're doing being assessed in relation to the environment. Again, that is something he wants to be enforced, not a voluntary code. And he also wants a world political authority with teeth to regulate this. There's a picture there of the United Nations. He really wants UN bodies to be given more authority to regulate the way countries behave. This idea wasn't new. He takes the idea straight from Caritas and Veritate, where Benedict suggests this in relation to financial affairs. So both popes are really calling for a very significant qualification or weakening of the idea of independent national sovereignty. And that is a very controversial line for them to take, and one that would be criticized not only by President Trump's administration until last year, but many others, including, if people were really honest about it, a lot of politicians in this country. The Church sees national sovereignty as being something very, very qualified. And we see exactly what that means because of the urgency of the issues addressed in Laudato Si. And that's what the Pope is trying to address. Before the break, I just want to conclude with looking at a section that comes up towards the end. From section 238, really. That's part 7 of the final chapter, Ecological Education and Spirituality. One of the things that's very, very important in Catholic social teaching is being able to make links between what we say about how we should live in the world and how the world should be, and what we believe about God. And sometimes we've not been very good at doing that. Sometimes other Christians have been better at doing it. For example, the Anglican social tradition was often better at making links between what we say about social justice and the doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation than Catholic writers were until recently. So here, Francis wants to root what he's saying about the world in our spirituality and in our doctrine of God. How we need to root all this in what we believe about God as one God in 3 persons, joined in a community of love, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And here he draws on the favorite theologian of Pope Benedict, that is the Franciscan Saint Bonaventure. He talks about how we can see something of the nature of God as Trinity in the world of nature. I'll just quote section 239. For Christians, Believing in one God whose Trinitarian communion suggests that the Trinity has left its mark on all creation. St. Bonaventure went so far as to say that human beings, before sin, were able to see how each creature testifies that God is three. The reflection of the Trinity was there to be recognized in nature when that book was open to man and our eyes had not yet become darkened. The Franciscan saint teaches us that each creature bears in itself a specifically Trinitarian structure, so real that it could readily be contemplated if only the human gaze were not so partial, dark, and fragile. In this way, he points out to us the challenge of trying to read reality in a Trinitarian key. It's quite a powerful reflection on how we see God reflected in the world in which we live. And here in this section too, he talks about our common home, and this language helps us understand not only the world, but helps us understand God more deeply as well. People often think that the doctrine of the Trinity is quite heavy going, quite hard work. And he finishes on the note of seeing the world in which we live as a place that we care about. And as with many papal letters, he concludes with a reflection on our Blessed Lady as Queen of Creation and a prayer to her.
Well, welcome back, everyone, and thank you to Father Ashley for a very stimulating presentation. And it has stimulated quite a lot of questions. So let's go straight ahead to those. And the first one is, what difference does COVID make? Obviously, Laudato Si was written before the outbreak of COVID. I wonder if you've got any comment about that in relation to Laudato Si.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I to some extent, I think it's still work in progress, because just as the virus is still with us in different ways in different parts of the world, I think in some ways perhaps we're only beginning to unpack what it means. But I suppose the two big areas where it's important, I think the Pope has said this himself in various homilies and statements. First of all, quite a lot of the evidence that seems to be around about how the thing actually started in China connects to poor care for the environment, a disease crossing species because of the careless way animals are kept. So some of the possible explanations as to how the thing started relate to poor care for creatures or carelessness. The other thing is that I suppose the way in which it spread says something about globalization, about ways in which we travel. And one of the challenges arising from care for the environment is to do with air travel, the use of fuel and so on, and the ways in which people travel around the world contributed to a very rapid spread in the virus. And indeed, in a way, not being attentive to viruses is in a sense a sign of carelessness, isn't it? About a lack of respect for nature. So, I mean, there are enormous issues that link things together, but COVID has also had the effect of accelerating a lot of tendencies in the world and making many of the concerns raised in Laudato Si even more urgent.
Okay. I have a question about Teilhard de Chardin, who's a Jesuit paleontologist, etc., mentioned in Laudato Si. Could you please explain simply what his contribution to the debate is? So there's a challenge.
Yes, I'm not by any means an expert in Teilhard de Chardin. It's a very brief and almost tantalizing reference, unless I've missed something, simply in a footnote. And the Pope doesn't say, it doesn't reference any of Teilhard's works. it's in the section on yes, what he says, he's talking, this is section 83.
Yeah.
The ultimate destiny of the universe is the fullness of God, Pope says, which has already been attained by the risen Christ, the measure of the maturity of all things. Now that sentence is not terribly easy to understand. There's quite a lot there. And then the footnote says, against this horizon, we can set the contribution of Father Teilhard de Chardin. But then he goes on to quote other people, two or three popes. It's important because in the 1950s, Teilhard de Chardin, as many of you will know, was under a cloud, like many other theologians, until the pontificate of John the 23rd and the Second Vatican Council. His acceptance of the theory of evolution was seen as very problematic. Like de Lubac, many other people, his books were not allowed in seminaries and so on. He was certainly out of favor. So for him to be referred to positively in a papal encyclical is itself quite a big thing. I think it's a pity that the Pope doesn't say a bit more about him here, and he may have done elsewhere. And I was trying to think of something that Teilhard wrote that might fit in with this. And I came up with something that's in the Hymn of the Universe. And some of you may know this, where Teilhard reflects on exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. It's a section called, in the chapter Christ in the World of Matter, there's a section called the Monstrance. And this also links up a bit with what the Pope says in Laudato Si about the Eucharist and the use of material things, which God does in bread and wine to impart his grace to us. Now, Teilhard is imagining a conversation with somebody giving an account of looking at a monstrance. So this guy says, I had then the impression as I gazed at the host that its surface was gradually spreading out like a spot of oil, but of course much more swiftly and luminously. At the beginning, it seemed to me that I alone had noticed any change, that it was taking place without awakening any desire. But little by little, as the white orb grew and grew in space till it seemed to be drawing quite close to me, I heard a subdued sound, an immeasurable murmur, as when the rising tide extends its silver waves over the world, over the algae, which tremble and dilate at its approach, and when the burning heather crackles as fire spreads over the earth. Now, there's a lot more of that, but basically what Teilhard is doing in that very imaginative passage is linking the sacred host, bread changed into the body of Christ, with the world of creation, algae, heather burning, and so on. I think it's that sort of link between the created world and what we believe about God that I think means that Teilhard is essentially singing from the same hymn sheet as Francis. But it needs a lot more work, and perhaps somebody's doing a doctoral thesis on the relationship between Teilhard de Chardin and Laudato Si, but that's what I picked up. But others here might know much more about Teilhard.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a contribution from a Franciscan friar. I feel the references to St. Francis are a good way in to considering the Pope's teachings, remembering that Francis composed his own hymn because he felt that creation was not being properly appreciated by his own contemporaries. So would you like to make a comment on that?
Yes, that's right. I mean, the very beginning of the encyclical, you can see how the Pope is so deeply in tune, really, with his namesake, who he took his name. I think that's valuable for all sorts of reasons. Pope Francis, Saint Francis, is, apart from anything else, a very accessible saint, one who many Christians and others are familiar with, much more than many saints. Though I think sometimes the portrayal of Francis can be a little sentimentalized, but it's quite clear in this letter that his approach, as exemplified in that hymn, is very, very powerful indeed. But the second reason it's important is that we shouldn't simply see our abuse of this planet as a modern problem. So the timelessness, if you like, of the message is something we need to capture and remind people of, particularly if those people are critical of the Pope for inventing something new, if they claim that. What St. Francis is trying to say in the Canticle of Creation shows how human beings have often damaged the planet. The first reading at Mass tonight, which I've been thinking about because, like Father Adrian and many of us, I got to preach, is Isaiah's vision from chapter 35 of the parched land having gushing water and so on, which shows that our reflection of how sin distorts the planet and how that can be changed and overcome in the coming of the kingdom of God goes back up to the 8th century BC. So there are all sorts of ways in which the message of Laudato Si is timeless.
Okay. This one may relate slightly to Teilhard, but how does one relate concern for the creation to the celebration of the Eucharist?
Right. Well, fortunately, the Holy Father deals with this in section 236 and following. So again, this is towards the end of the letter, so it's like the reflection on the Trinity. He's trying to root what we say about creation in our liturgical and spiritual life. So he says, for example, in 236, it's in the Eucharist that all that has been created finds its greatest exaltation. Grace, which tends to manifest itself tangibly, found unsurpassable expression when God himself became man and gave himself as food for his creatures. The Lord, in the culmination of the mystery of the Incarnation, chose to reach our intimate depths through a fragment of matter. The heart of all Catholic sacramental theology is the idea of material things being used by God, but it's powerful, particularly in the Eucharist. Then the Pope goes on in the next section to talk about the Sunday Eucharist. So treating Sunday properly, the idea of rhythm of life, a day of rest, again, is part of how we respect the created order. And this, of course, he's drawing on John Paul II's Dies Domini and so on. So what we say about not working every day, all day, is linked to all this. So yes, there's a great deal there, but again, it could all be further expanded on.
Okay. Have you noticed any development in the thought of Pope Francis since Laudato Si? I suppose this is referring to Fratelli Tutti, but perhaps specifically on the issue of care for creation.
Not in a sort of systematic way, at least not that I've been aware of, but I haven't studied his utterances in that much detail, except that I think that alongside others, there's a growing feeling of urgency. I mean, I think how can something be more urgent than Laudato Si? But I mean, it is getting more urgent. And I think he, in the address to diplomats that I referred to in my talk, he focuses on our lack of care for the environment as being one of the signs of a sick world, alongside the pandemic and other things. So I think commentators like Christopher Lamb and Austin Ivory, who've written about the Pope, have stressed, I think particularly recently, that because of all that's happened because of the pandemic, Francis is, if you like, a man in a hurry. He has an agenda, and this is part of the agenda, and he's conscious, I think, that there's an even greater urgency, partly because he's getting older, he's just had an operation, and he might well think that he may not be Pope for that much longer. So I think that's focused his mind a bit more as well. He certainly doesn't have any intention of resigning, but I think he's, like all of us, 6 years older than he was in 2015. And that, I think, people are aware of his health problems. He missed things at the beginning of the year because of his sciatica and so on. So I think that's part of what's happening as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, this is a pastoral one now. How do we respond to those who say that concern for creation has nothing to do with faith?
It's difficult to know where to start.
Genesis.
Yes, that's a good place to start. I mean, it's certainly a serious problem. You remember, I'm sure many of you, that the bishops in this country issued a joint pastoral letter for the Feast of Pentecost on the care of creation, which was criticized by many people active in environmental theology for not saying enough, not going far enough, not in fact mentioning Laudato Si. On the other hand, I was told by some bishops that in some dioceses, some clergy criticized it as well because they didn't see what it had to do with the Feast of Pentecost. And in some cases, the priest would refuse to read it out. So I suppose you do go back to Genesis. You talk about the Spirit moving across the waters, very second verse of Genesis, I think. And I think I would start with chapter 2 of the encyclical. Perhaps distilled a bit for people. I think if you're able to draw on the scriptural imagery, then that is a good way in for people. Perhaps we've been helped in the last couple of years by the fact that we had the year of the Word of God, in which Catholics were encouraged to read the Bible more, to know the Bible better. And I suppose this issue and the concerns raised by the Pope are a good context for that. So that's what I would try and do. I think back to the Bible, really, but I don't need to persuade you of that, Adrian.
Yeah, well, perhaps I can add, for the last, since 2014, the Pontifical Biblical Commission has been working on a document on biblical anthropology, how human beings are presented in the Bible. And what has astounded me, because working on it and then last year working on the translation into English, is how many connections there are between what the Commission is saying and what Pope Francis is saying, particularly in the by way of social teaching. And I would recommend this as something which, we weren't in collusion. We didn't ask the Pope what he was going to write. He didn't ask us what we were going to write. And I think it's because the source is Scripture. And that document, I think, is particularly relevant. Perhaps there's no other, I would say this, wouldn't I? But no other Biblical Commission document has been before in the sense of addressing issues which are crucial to the present day. It's published, by the way, by Dalton Longman and Todd. I just throw that in, and it's very reasonably priced. What is Man? It's called.
That's good. Thank you.
Another, perhaps a final question, which is really putting you on the spot, is: are you optimistic about COP26? And if not, what do we do next?
I'm afraid I don't see very convincing reasons to be optimistic from some of the commentaries that I've read, but I've not kept up to date in detail with speculation about it. I think that there are some good signs, but I think that many of the tensions between countries at the moment, for all sorts of reasons, mean that it's not a good time for the sort of cooperation needed. I think that some countries can make very enlightened statements and even sign up to very important courses of action. But at the moment, I think, for example, the tensions between Western countries and, for example, the Russian Federation and China in particular will probably prevent the sort of cooperation needed. You've still got a major problem with some countries in relation to their attitude to the entire issue, particularly Brazil. Second part of your question, if not, what do we do next? I suppose we just carry on trying to stress the urgency, really. The issue mustn't be allowed to go away. But people also mustn't fall into despair. I think that the message of hope in Laudato Si and in what the Holy Father teaches in all sorts of areas is important for Christians. So that there are big challenges, really. But I'm not terribly optimistic, I'm afraid.
Yes. I'm just looking at the final part of Laudato Si, where Pope Francis presents a prayer for our earth and a Christian prayer in union with creation. Just let me read the opening lines of the prayer for our earth, which is in paragraph 246. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. And those lines are so much in them, and I think they also perhaps give us a connection with your next talk, Ashley, which is about Fratelli Tutti, that we're all brothers and sisters, as we look at the problems of the world, the issues that are around from another perspective.